I'm Ava Whitfield, 31 years old, and at the long oak table of our family's will reading. My parents smiled while a check slid toward my sister's hands, as if it had been waiting there all along. The room smelled like lemon polish and old paper, and every breath felt measured, as if sound itself might tip the balance. My father's cufflinks flashed when he turned to me and said almost gently that it was time I learned to earn my own. I kept my face still, my fingers resting flat, the pulse in my neck loud enough to count. Then a gray-suited man stood from the back row with a worn envelope in his palm, edges softened by years. My mother's smile thinned. My sister stopped smoothing her skirt. The attorney cleared his throat, and the room gathered itself the way a sky gathers before a storm. Somewhere beyond the window, church bells marked the hour, and I understood that whatever lay inside that envelope would change the story we had told about our family. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if you've ever sat quietly while someone decided your worth for you. I was raised on the edge of a pasture where the wind carried the sound of cicadas into the kitchen, and my grandmother kept a tin of sugar cookies in a blue cupboard by the back door. My grandfather George read journals early every morning at that same table and never once told me to hush when I asked too many questions. Our house was modest but tended the kind of place where you mended things instead of replacing them and said grace whether there was stew or sandwiches. My parents prized appearances more than rituals, careful with clothes and charities and the way a photograph looked on a mantel. They loved us in the language they understood, results polish poise. As I grew, I found work that felt like breath to me, small experiments data that lined up the way stars settle into constellations, the quiet thrill of watching something living respond to care. My sister Lauren learned the rhythms our parents favored and wore them like a well-cut dress. I learned to carry my notebooks to tuck my joy into pockets where it wouldn't draw the wrong kind of light. When I left for college, the ranch became a place I visited between semesters and internships, a morning walk with my grandfather, through dew-wet grass, a cup of coffee with my grandmother in the screened porch while she told me which magnolia needed pruning. It was simple and clean and good, and it steadied me against the rooms I was learning to enter, rooms with tall windows and practice smiles where people spoke fluently about legacy and managed not to say much about love. The first shift I felt was small enough to miss if you weren't watching. Calls went unanswered. Texts drifted off. Invitations arrived late, with apologies that felt copied and pasted. When Granddad's health began to fail, I tried to bridge the distance, but my messages sank into silence, like pebbles dropped in a deep well. I drove to the ranch one afternoon in early spring and found the gate closed and my sister's car in the drive. She opened the door, said everyone was resting, and told me to try again next week. I believed her. I always wanted to. By the time we gathered for the will, I knew how to sit up straight and keep my face steady. The attorney's office was all quiet, carpet and framed degrees, a cool refuge from the humid air outside. Lauren's check appeared with the rustle of paper and a soft clink of pen against glass, a gesture so smooth it could have been rehearsed. My father's hand rested on my mother's sleeve, and she gave me the kind of smile meant to look kind from a distance. My name hadn't been spoken. My grandfather's had been, and that was enough to keep me still. When Harold Blake rose with that envelope, the room changed temperature by a degree, the way a storm tilts the air before the first drop falls. The edges were frayed, and my grandfather's name was written across the flap in the neat block letters he used to label cardboard boxes in the barn. Mr. Blake said there was one last instruction from George Whitfield to be read with the family present, and for the first time all morning my grandmother's shoulders eased, as if a weight she'd been carrying had shifted ever so slightly. My mother glanced at my father. My sister's mouth opened and closed without a sound. I thought of the ranch, then the chipped white door, the wind chimes that always sounded like summer, the red dirt beyond the fence where my grandfather once let me build a crooked greenhouse out of old window frames. I remembered the blue cupboard and the sugar cookies, and the way he'd lean over my shoulder to look at the scribbles in my notebook like they were worth his time. I felt the distance between that kitchen and this polished room, and I could not tell which one I was standing in more. The attorney slid a letter from the envelope, careful with the creases, and placed it on the table where the light from the window fell across the page. Ruth. My grandmother lifted her chin the way she does when she's decided something is over. My father shifted in his chair. My mother's fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. Lauren fixed her gaze on the far wall, as if she could read an answer there. The attorney tapped the page once more, habit than flourish, and said he would begin. And in that pause, the small held breath, before a voice enters a room, I understood that whatever this letter said would bring us back to the ranch whether we wanted to go or not. The attorney's voice filled the room steady and professional as he unfolded my grandfather's letter. Each word seemed to pull the air tighter around us. My grandmother sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the paper as if she already knew what it contained. My mother's posture stiffened, and my father's gaze darted toward the window anywhere but the table. Lauren's expression wavered between confusion and dread, her confidence slipping like a mask that no longer fit. When the reading ended, silence stretched long and sharp. My grandmother rose, her movements deliberate. "That's enough for now," she said quietly, though her tone left no room for argument. "We'll continue this where it began at the ranch. I hadn't set foot on that property in over a year, not since before my grandfather passed. Driving up the familiar dirt road, I felt the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the weight of memories pressing close. The magnolia trees still leaned east, the porch chimes still swayed in the wind, but the house felt different, emptier, almost waiting. I stepped out of the car and stared at the front door, the white paint chipped at the edges, just like I remembered. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine, but underneath was something heavier, the echo of everything left unsaid. When the door opened, my grandmother's voice was the same as ever, sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "So you finally decided to show up." She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, gray hair pinned neatly, eyes bright but guarded. For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "Grandma." I started. I didn't know about, but she cut me off with a glance. "They told me you were too busy, that you didn't want to be bothered." Her tone wavered just slightly. "Your grandfather called for you every day." The words landed harder than I expected. I took a slow breath, trying to steady it. "That's not true," I said. "I tried to call. I came by in March, but Lauren was here. She said everyone was gone." My grandmother frowned, her voice softening. "We were here every single day." She turned without another word and walked inside. The living room looked exactly as I remembered, faded floral curtains, a clock ticking too loudly, framed photographs that made the years blur together. She picked up an old leather notepad from the mantel and handed it to me. "He kept calling this number," she said. I recognized my grandfather's handwriting immediately, neat and blocky, but the number wasn't mine. "This isn't right," I murmured. "This isn't even close to my phone number." Her hand trembled as she looked at the page. "They told us you changed it. Said you didn't want to be tracked down, that you were ashamed." I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "No, Grandma. They lied. They wanted to cut me off from you." She sank slowly into her chair, the one by the fireplace where my grandfather used to read in the evenings. The room felt smaller, like it was holding its breath. "They told me the funeral was at noon," I said quietly. I showed up and no one was there. Her eyes met mine, clouded and sad. "The service was at 9. They told everyone you didn't come, that you didn't care." The sound of the clock filled the silence between us. I felt my chest tighten until breathing hurt. "I would never have missed it," I whispered. My grandmother reached for my hand, her grip gentle but certain. "I know that now," she said. "We both do." We sat together for a long time. Outside, the wind brushed dry leaves across the porch, and the scent of the magnolias drifted faintly through the open window. Finally, she stood, her resolve gathering in her shoulders. "I'm calling them," she said. I followed her into the kitchen. The old rotary phone still hung on the wall, the same one my grandfather had refused to replace. She dialed each number with deliberate care, her voice turning cold and clipped. "Denise, I need you, Charles and Lauren here, now." I could hear my mother's faint protest through the receiver. My grandmother didn't hesitate. "No, it cannot wait." She hung up and turned to me. "Harold's on his way, too. Your grandfather left instructions that are to be read with everyone present." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The next hour passed slowly. I sat at the kitchen table tracing the wood grain with my fingertips. That table had been my grandfather's morning place where he read my letters from school and asked about my research. The hum of the old refrigerator was steady in the background, a sound that had always meant home. When footsteps finally sounded on the porch, my grandmother's eyes met mine. "Stay here until I call you." I listened as the door opened and their voices filled the front room. My mother's cheerful tone too bright to be sincere. My father's calm, practiced patience. My sister's sigh of annoyance. "Seriously," Lauren muttered, "this couldn't have waited." Then came my grandmother's reply, firm and level. "Please sit down. Mr. Blake will be here shortly." I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel the tension pressing through the walls. The air thickened with the sound of the front door opening once more, followed by Harold Blake's even tone. "This won't take long," he said, "but it must be done properly." My grandmother's voice followed Ava, "Come in now." When I stepped into the living room, 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My mother's smile froze mid-expression. My father's jaw tightened. Lauren's complexion drained of color. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my shoes. My grandmother gestured toward the empty armchair across from them, and I sat keeping my posture straight. Harold gave a polite nod and opened his briefcase. "This," he began, "is the last will and testament of George R. Whitfield, recorded and sealed per his request. In addition, there is a handwritten letter addressed to his granddaughter, Ava Whitfield." Lauren shifted in her seat, her bracelet clinking softly. My father exhaled through his nose. Harold's tone didn't change as he read, "To my wife Ruth Whitfield, I leave our ranch, the house, and sufficient funds for her care." My grandmother's face didn't move. "To my granddaughter Ava, I leave the Whitfield Research Annex located at 317 Laurel Creek Road, including all laboratory equipment research accounts and intellectual property filed under Whitfield Innovations." Lauren's chair scraped the floor as she stood abruptly. "What?" she snapped. "You gave her the annex." Her voice shook. "You told me?" She turned toward our parents, but neither spoke. My mother looked down at her hands. My father's eyes remained fixed on the far wall. Harold continued reading as if nothing had interrupted him. "The remainder of my estate, financial holdings, stocks, and retirement accounts shall be divided equally between my 2 granddaughters, Ava and Lauren Whitfield." The silence that followed was thick and alive. My sister stared at me, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "That's not fair," she said finally. "I stayed. I took care of him." My grandmother's voice broke the air like a crack of thunder. "You performed," she said. "There's a difference." My mother rose halfway from her chair. "Mother, please," but my grandmother cut her off. "No, enough pretending." Her voice steadied. "This family has been living on half-truths for too long." I looked from one face to another and saw the realization sink in. Every lie, every careful omission had led us here. The lawyer folded the papers, his work done, but no one moved. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the porch chimes, a sound that felt almost like punctuation. Lauren's anger drained into something else, fear maybe, or shame. My father cleared his throat, but my grandmother spoke first. "Leave," she said simply. "No yelling, no theatrics. Just a command." My mother stared at her, stunned. "You can't mean I do," she replied. "All 3 of you. Go." For a moment, no one moved. Then Lauren grabbed her bag and stormed toward the door, heels striking the floor with sharp rhythm. My parents followed their words low and scattered. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, quieter than I expected. I stayed seated, my pulse still racing. The house was silent again, but this time the quiet didn't hurt. My grandmother walked slowly to the sofa and sat down, her hands calm in her lap. "They'll come back," I said softly. She looked toward the window where sunlight flickered through the trees. "Maybe," she said, "but we don't have to let them in." Her words settled over me, steady and final. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of expectation slide off my shoulders. Somewhere in that silence, I realized we weren't just closing a door, we were opening another, and whatever waited beyond it, I was finally ready to see. That night, the ranch was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite rest. It just sits heavy in the air, full of everything that's been said and everything that still lingers unspoken. After my parents and Lauren left, my grandmother made tea. She didn't ask if I wanted any. She simply set a mug down in front of me and sat across the table, her hands wrapped around her own cup. The clock above the stove ticked louder than I remembered its rhythm, marking the space where family used to fit. Neither of us said much for a long time. I watched the steam rise and curl, fading into the stillness between us. Finally, she broke the silence. "He built that annex for you," she said softly. "Started planning it 5 years ago, before he got sick." The words caught me off guard. "He never mentioned it," I said. "He wanted it to be a surprise," she replied. "A place where you wouldn't have to ask permission to be yourself." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. I felt something loosen inside me, a knot that had been there for years. I reached for the letter Harold had read earlier. The paper was already soft at the folds, worn from being handled. My grandfather's handwriting filled the page, broad, confident, and familiar. I traced the lines with my fingertips, reading the words again, the ones that had cut through every lie my family had told. "You wrote your own role," he'd said, "and that my girl takes courage." The air in the room shifted. My grandmother leaned back and sighed. "You know," she said, "I used to think your quietness was distance, but now I see it was strength." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes after realizing a truth too late. "You remind me of him when he was young, always thinking, always building." I nodded, but words wouldn't come. I was exhausted, though I hadn't moved more than a few feet all evening. When she told me to stay the night, I didn't argue. My old room hadn't changed much. The wallpaper faded, the window frame chipped, and the ceiling still dotted with those glow-in-the-dark stars I'd begged my grandfather to help me stick up. He'd arranged them into constellations, just like the ones from the field guides we used to read together. Lying there now, I stared at those faint shapes and thought about how long I'd been trying to earn love from people who had none to spare. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and forgiving. The smell of coffee drifted down the hall. I found my grandmother in the kitchen, already dressed and reading the newspaper. She looked up as I walked in. "You sleep any?" she asked. I shrugged. "A little." She folded the paper and motioned to the chair beside her. "Then drink this and tell me what comes next." I stared into the cup for a moment before answering. "I think I need to see it," I said. "The annex." She nodded as if she'd been waiting for me to say it. "He'd like that," she said simply. The drive to Laurel Creek took less than an hour. The road narrowed into a single-lane path lined with oaks and pines, and at the end stood a wide barn with a tin roof catching the morning light. It didn't look like much from the outside, but as soon as I stepped through the double doors, I stopped breathing for a moment. Inside, sunlight poured through glass panels along the east wall, illuminating rows of clean work tables and shelves lined with unopened equipment, microscopes, centrifuges, even a 3D printer still wrapped in plastic. In the center of the room sat a single workbench with a notebook on top. I knew it instantly. The faded green cover, the worn edges, the ink smudges from my younger self. It was my childhood science journal, the one I thought I'd lost in college. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first page was filled with messy sketches of honeybee patterns, followed by charts of rainfall experiments and small notes in my grandfather's handwriting, tiny stars in the margins, gentle reminders to keep asking why. I sank onto a nearby stool, the smell of wood and paper grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. He hadn't just built me a lab, he had built me a home for my mind. For the next few weeks, the annex became my world. I called 2 friends from my graduate program, Tara Simmons and Micah Johnson, people who had once shared long nights of lab work and fast food between research papers. They didn't hesitate. Within days, the 3 of us were sorting through equipment and clearing space for projects. We started small, a local grant focused on micro-irrigation systems for small farms. Then came a partnership with a regional co-op to test sustainable crop rotations. It wasn't glamorous. We made mistakes, burned through supplies, and spent nights wondering if any of it mattered. But the place had a heartbeat, and we matched its rhythm. I'd walk through the doors each morning to find Tara already analyzing data, Micah tuning a pump, and the hum of machines blending with the rustle of wind outside. It felt like purpose, quiet, steady, and real. Some evenings I stayed late after they'd gone. I'd sit on the floor by the storage closet, surrounded by papers, coffee cups, and the soft hum of cooling equipment. One night after another rejected grant notice, I unfolded my grandfather's letter again. The light caught the edge of his handwriting, and I read the same line I'd been carrying in my head for months. "You wrote your own role." It didn't sound like advice anymore. It sounded like a challenge. I pulled out a blank proposal form and began writing, not for another research study, but for something new. A youth science program for rural schools, a space for the kind of kids who never got to touch a microscope or see their ideas taken seriously. I called it the Little Scientist Initiative. By spring, we launched our first pilot with 12 students from 3 small towns. We visited their classrooms with portable labs, teaching them how to collect samples, record data, and observe. Each student received a notebook, a replica of my own green journal with my grandfather's quote stamped on the first page, "Write the things they don't understand. One day, the world will." Watching those kids work was like watching the world reset itself. There was a girl named Amber, quiet and sharp-eyed, who spent hours studying bee behavior in her backyard. When she handed me her notes, smudged and half illegible, I saw brilliance in every line. "You actually read all of this?" she asked shyly. "Of course I did," I told her. The way her face lit up reminded me of the first time my grandfather looked at me that way. Each visit made me realize what he'd left behind wasn't just equipment or property, it was permission. Permission to build without apology, to create without waiting for approval. The annex wasn't a monument, it was a map. Every decision he made, every secret he protected led me here. By the end of the year, we had expanded the program to 5 counties. Schools sent thank you letters, parents volunteered to drive kids to weekend sessions, and the local paper ran a feature on the barn that became a lab. It didn't make the past disappear, but it changed the weight of it. One evening, as the last light faded across the fields, I locked the annex doors and stood outside. The air smelled like earth and rain. The magnolias near the fence rustled, and for the first time the sound didn't carry sorrow, it carried memory, the kind that steadies you instead of breaking you. I looked back at the building, its windows glowing soft against the dark, and thought about how far that letter had reached from one man's belief to a classroom of children learning to ask questions out loud. And somewhere inside that quiet, I heard my grandfather's voice again, not as echo or dream, but as direction. The next morning, the mail arrived. Among the usual forms and supply invoices was an envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. The return label read, "Lauren Whitfield, Tampa, Florida." I held it for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single line, "I'd like to visit the annex." I stared at the words, unsure what to feel. But as the sun climbed higher over the fields, I realized I already knew what would come next. And whatever it was, I was ready to face it. I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Lauren's handwriting was smaller than I remembered, almost hesitant. The message inside was short, just a single line asking to visit the annex. No explanations, no apologies. For a moment I thought about ignoring it, pretending it had gotten lost in the mail. But something in the careful spacing of her words stopped me. It wasn't the voice of the sister who used to smirk across the dinner table. It sounded like someone who didn't quite know where she belonged anymore. The following week, I wrote back, keeping my response simple. "You're welcome to visit. Thursday at 10. I didn't tell my grandmother or my team. When the day came, I arrived early, unlocking every door and checking each hallway as if I needed to prepare the building itself. Sunlight poured through the glass panels, and the air smelled faintly of lavender from the garden outside. I had grown used to this calm routine, steady, unbothered by the noise of the past. Seeing her again would disturb that balance, and I wasn't sure what version of her would walk through the door. At 10 sharp, the sound of tires on gravel reached the entrance. Through the glass, I saw a figure step out of a dark sedan. For a second, I didn't recognize her. Lauren's posture was different, smaller somehow. She wore a navy coat too big for her frame, her hair pulled back in a way that looked more practical than polished. When she walked in, she hesitated at the threshold, her eyes sweeping over the lobby. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "He always knew who you were," she said, looking up at my grandfather's portrait on the wall. "Even when I didn't." I didn't move toward her, just nodded slightly. "Would you like to see the lab?" I asked. She nodded, and I led the way. The click of her shoes echoed faintly against the tile floor. We moved through the main research hall where microscopes lined the tables and rows of plants grew beneath panels of light. She asked questions, not the kind meant to sound impressive, but small, honest ones. "Do you run this on grants? How many people work here now? Do the students get to publish?" Her tone surprised me. She wasn't pretending to understand. She wanted to. I explained as we walked, pointing out the irrigation models and the data boards our interns used. When we reached the greenhouse wing, she stopped by the viewing window. A group of middle school students were testing soil moisture, laughing when one of their sensors blinked red. "They're part of the youth program," I said. "We bring them in twice a month." Lauren smiled faintly. "They look so confident," she murmured. "I don't think I ever felt that way at their age." We continued outside to the community garden behind the annex. Families from nearby towns had plots there, each one marked with small wooden signs painted by children. Rows of lettuce and squash caught the morning light, and in the distance a father showed his son how to loosen the soil around a row of beans. Lauren stopped near the railing, her fingers brushing against the metal. "I didn't come to fight," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see what he built for you, and what you built with it." Her eyes stayed on the garden. "I know I don't deserve to ask for forgiveness." I stood beside her, listening to the sound of wind moving through the trees. "You don't have to ask," I said. "We both just needed to start telling the truth." She nodded slowly. Her hands wouldn't stop moving, tugging at her sleeves, tracing circles on the rail. "I thought if I kept doing what they wanted, they'd finally see me," she said. "But it was never enough. And when you left, they turned that emptiness into anger and handed it to me." Her voice broke slightly. "I took it because it was the only thing they offered. I didn't have an answer." We stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking. Eventually, she turned toward me, her expression uncertain. "Would it be all right if I helped here sometimes? Not with the science stuff, maybe with the kids. Communication workshops or something." I studied her face, searching for the performance I used to know. It wasn't there. "If you're serious," I said, "the door's open." That was how it began. Lauren returned the next month, this time in sneakers instead of heels, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She arrived early carrying a notebook and a thermos of coffee. The students adored her from the start. They called her Coach V, short for Coach Vanessa, a nickname that came from one of the more talkative boys who'd misheard her last name and never bothered to correct it. She didn't mind. She taught them how to speak clearly during presentations, how to make eye contact, how to explain complicated ideas in simple words. Watching her in that classroom was strange at first. The same voice that once dismissed my work now lifted up the shyest child in the room. When the program ended that summer, she handed me a folder. "I put together a guide," she said, almost embarrassed, "for the kids who get nervous talking in front of others." I opened it that night. The pages were filled with notes, diagrams, and phrases meant to calm anxious minds. It wasn't perfect, but it was kind. Time softened what anger had once hardened. Lauren kept volunteering twice a year, helping with outreach and student showcases. We didn't talk much about the past, but we didn't have to. Our conversations became practical, grounded shared calendars, supply lists, ideas for new workshops. Sometimes she stayed late after sessions sitting with the students while they drew plans for future projects. I'd find her there long after everyone else had gone quietly cleaning up or writing notes to herself. The rest of the family never reached out. My parents sent an occasional holiday card, formal and distant. I never replied and they never pressed. The peace in that silence was something I learned to value. 6 years passed that way. The annex grew from a single renovated barn into a full research campus with 4 labs, 3 greenhouses, and over 60 acres of trial fields. We developed drought-resistant seeds that helped small farms survive record dry seasons. Universities began reaching out, first local ones, then from as far away as Kenya and Brazil. The program had outgrown its small-town beginnings. When the National Climate Innovation Grant arrived, it felt almost unreal. The ceremony was in San Francisco. I wore a navy suit and carried my grandfather's pocket watch, the one my grandmother gave me on my last birthday. Inside the lid was a photo of me at 10 years old, grinning beside my honeybee experiment. I could almost hear his voice as I stood on that stage. Afterward, I flew home to Charleston and drove straight to the ranch. My grandmother was waiting on the porch, a blanket over her knees. Her health had slowed her, but her mind was still sharp. When I told her about the award, she smiled. He would have been proud, she said, but I think he already was. The annex had become more than a building. It was a legacy written in soil and light, a continuation of a promise he'd made long before I was old enough to understand it. And standing there with the evening sun slipping through the magnolia branches, I realized how far that promise had carried us. Lauren arrived later that evening with a folder under her arm. She'd just finished another youth workshop and stopped by on her way home. My grandmother greeted her warmly, the way she used to greet old friends. We sat on the porch together until the sky turned deep blue. The air was soft, filled with the sound of crickets and the faint clinking of wind chimes. "I'm thinking of expanding the student program," I said. "Maybe a regional summer camp next year." Lauren nodded. "You'll need a communications coordinator," she said lightly, then smiled. It was the first time in years her smile didn't carry apology. Later, when the porch lights flickered on and she stood to leave, she paused at the steps. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me try again." I watched her walk toward her car, her silhouette fading into the dark, and felt the strange quiet of something healed, not forgotten. Inside, my grandmother dozed in her chair, the pocket watch glinting beside her on the table. The night breeze carried the scent of the fields through the open window. I picked up the watch and held it in my palm, listening to the soft tick that had once steadied my grandfather's heart. Tomorrow would bring another day, students' research decisions, but in that moment the house felt full again, and for the first time the quiet wasn't heavy, it was peace. What I didn't know then was that the next letter waiting on my desk would change everything once more. It came from the National Institute for Agricultural Research, marked with a gold seal and a request I hadn't expected to partner on a global initiative in my grandfather's name. It was the beginning of a new Chapter 1 that would test everything I'd built so far. The envelope from the National Institute for Agricultural Research sat on my desk for 3 days before I opened it. I wasn't avoiding it exactly, just letting the moment settle. The seal was gold, the kind they use for official partnerships, the kind that carries the weight of expectations. When I finally broke it, I found a letter inside written in crisp type and signed by a director I'd met years earlier at a sustainability conference. They wanted to create a global initiative, one that focused on soil restoration and drought recovery, and they wanted it built in collaboration with the Whitfield Annex. More than that, they wanted to name it after my grandfather. The proposal was ambitious. It would link research centers across 3 continents, fund student exchanges, and require me to split my time between Charleston and Washington, D.C. I sat back in my chair staring at the letter, feeling both excitement and a quiet ache. It was everything I'd worked toward, and yet it meant leaving behind the rhythm I'd finally built. The morning walks through the fields, the laughter of students during workshops, my grandmother's voice calling from the porch when dinner was ready. That evening, I brought the letter home. My grandmother was in her armchair, the same quilt folded across her lap. The news came out in a rush before I could stop myself. "They want to name it after him," I said. Her eyes brightened instantly. "After George," I nodded. "The Whitfield Global Initiative." She smiled faintly, her expression soft but proud. "He'd say you made good on the soil," she said, echoing one of his old phrases. Then she looked at me more closely. "You're not sure about it, are you?" I hesitated. "It's big, Grandma. It means travel time away, new staff, new systems. And I don't know if I'm ready to let go of what we built here." She reached across the armrest and took my hand. "You're not letting go," she said. "You're planting further." Her words stayed with me all night. I walked outside after she went to bed across the yard toward the magnolia trees. The night air carried the faint hum of crickets and the smell of soil after rain. I looked toward the annex glowing faintly in the distance and thought about how far the idea had already traveled from one small barn to 4 labs, from one dream to many. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to let it grow again. The next morning, I called a staff meeting. Tara and Micah sat across from me in the glass conference room, their notebooks already open. "They want us to lead an international partnership," I began. "It's a huge commitment, multiple labs, shared data, educational outreach. We'd be working with teams overseas." Tara's face lit up immediately. "That's incredible," she said. Micah leaned forward. "And they're naming it after your grandfather." I nodded. He smiled. "Then it's not just work. It's full circle." Still, I could hear the worry behind their excitement. It would stretch all of us thin, and it would change the annex in ways we couldn't yet predict. Over the next few weeks, we worked late into the evenings, drafting plans, setting up pilot studies, and preparing proposals for funding rounds. Lauren offered to help with communication materials and outreach strategy, and for the first time, we worked side by side, not as rivals, but as partners. The process wasn't smooth. Bureaucracy had its own rhythm, slow, methodical, frustrating. I spent hours on calls with committees explaining the annex's origins and goals, while Tara juggled field schedules and Micah restructured our data protocols. Some nights, I'd drive home past midnight and find the ranch dark, my grandmother's window the only one still glowing. She'd leave a thermos of tea by the door and a small note. "You're doing fine. The roots are holding." When the official approval arrived in early spring, the timing felt poetic. The magnolias were in bloom again, and the air carried that same early warmth I remembered from my childhood. The first press announcement went out a week later. Partnership established, program underway, inaugural research exchange set for Nairobi in July. It all felt bigger than me, bigger than what I'd once imagined when I first walked into that old barn. We hosted a small event at the annex to mark the launch. Local reporters came, students brought their families, and my grandmother sat in the front row wearing her best navy dress. Lauren handled the introductions, her voice steady as she spoke about community innovation and the legacy of a man who believed that every question deserved space to grow. When she finished, I stepped up to the microphone. Looking out over the crowd, I saw the faces of people who had shaped every chapter of this story. Students clutching their notebooks, colleagues who'd carried heavy work with quiet faith, and my grandmother, her hands clasped in her lap. "This place started with one idea," I said. That curiosity and compassion could coexist, that science could serve not just study, and that belief came from my grandfather. When the applause faded, I caught Lauren's eye. She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her mouth that needed no explanation. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The annex's new partnerships brought fresh faces and new projects. We received soil samples from Kenya, crop data from Brazil, and field footage from a partner lab in New Mexico. The research itself was demanding, but the connections felt like family scientists and farmers, exchanging notes, students sharing discoveries across oceans. I spent more time in airports than at home, and yet the work carried a kind of peace. Back at the ranch, my grandmother's health began to wane. It wasn't sudden, just gradual, a little more time